Chapter 1. Calin Homestead, Planet Castin Velorum System, Cygni Branch. Jack Calin drove the old solar buggy down the dusty, rock-littered path at the northernmost end of the Calin property. The property, an original homestead on the planet Castin in the Velorum System, had been in his family for more than 60 years. New Age rock music blasted from the speakers, echoing off the sides of the mountains that surrounded the path. Jack head-banging along with the drums as he drove. He bounced and jostled with each roll of the tires, turning the wheel in an attempt to avoid the worst of the rocks and boulders. His ass hurt. He was on his monthly inspection of the property lines. There wasn't much up in the northernmost areas of their property where the plains met the mountains. Once upon a time, his grandfather had regarded this area as having the most potential, as far as mining deposits go, on the entirety of their property. How wrong he had been. As it turned out, the rocky plains that led up to the mountains and made up 75% of the Calin property had been home to the deposits that had sustained them. The mountains had never produced much. They needed better equipment to get deeper into them, their grandfather had always said. The sun gave its last glimmers of the day. That meant that it was going to get cold, and quickly. Jack hated being out past dark. He always tried to make sure that he was back before the sun went down, but that wasn't going to be the case tonight. He'd have to deal with it. As the sun sank below the mountains and darkness enveloped him, he worked his way deeper into the hills. He turned the buggy headlights on. They were bright, but not bright enough to make avoiding the larger rocks any easier. He weaved his way through the path, cursing at each boulder he failed to avoid. It got colder. He could feel his hands going numb, the tingle prickling at his fingertips. It became difficult for him to grip the buggy's steering wheel. He slapped his hands against it just to put a little feeling back into them, but they ached, and he immediately wished that he hadn't. He crawled up the path at low speed, rock faces climbing 100 feet on either side of the path. The skies were clear, and the 2 moons above Castin shined brightly in the night sky. They were almost enough to illuminate the path on their own. The closer moon, Calio, was nearly twice as large as the other, Camina. As a kid, Jack had spent many nights staring up at the moons, wondering what was happening on the stations that orbited them, wishing that he would one day see them. He still hadn't managed to leave Castin, not even for a day. As he approached the northernmost edge of the property deep in the mountains, Jack could hardly take the cold anymore. Knowing that there was another road that he could take that would shave off 8 or 9 minutes from the journey home, he wasted no time heading that way once he saw the turn fork off from the main path. It had been a long time since he had come this way, or since anyone in his family had, most likely. He had ridden the buggy on this path hundreds of times as a kid. But as he had grown up and become less enthralled with exploring the property, the path had weathered. It was difficult to even recognize where the path was at times, and it had even more boulders than Jack had been dealing with on the previous path. At several points, rock slides had taken out the path, and Jack was forced to find creative ways to work around the debris. Luckily, the buggy was quite adept. Jack was trading earlier warmth for an even sorer ass, and he knew that he wasn't going to regret it one bit. Jack still remembered the path, somehow. He anticipated every turn and dip. As he arrived at a large, sweeping right-hand curve that came just before he would take off down the mountain in earnest, he saw something in the distance. At first, he thought that it might have been a light from a mining drone that had gotten lost. But the light was green, and their mining drones has orange lighting. It was so faint at first that he wondered if it wasn't just a dark-induced hallucination. But no, it wasn't a hallucination. As he got closer, the green shine got more pronounced. At first, it looked as if it was floating in midair, but as he neared the light source, he could see that it just looked strange because it was reflecting off of the wet stone walls of the hillside that surrounded it. Jack felt his heart flutter. It couldn't be. He pressed the pedal to the buggy's floor, no longer caring about the boulders, and pushed himself as quickly as he could toward the light. He nearly bounced out of the seat several times as he careened toward the source, his heart racing. It is. No fucking way. He pulled up to the green light emanating from the hillside, and all of the anticipation left his body as if it had just slid out of him. Within seconds, once he was over his shock, that anticipation was replaced with a sinking feeling. It ate away at his stomach, then it expanded until he could feel the dread throughout his whole body, then expanded further. Jack wondered if he would throw up and choked back a gag. The light's source was a material in the side of the hillside that faintly glowed green, lighting his face and the buggy in an eerie lighting. The hillside around it dug out perhaps 50 feet, with piles of rocks that had been removed on either side. The areas where the rocks had been cut from the hillside were blackened, scarred from high-intensity mining drone torches. His stomach twisted into a knot, and he puked off of the side of the buggy, splashing the front driver's side tire and door. Chapter 2. Calin Homestead, Planet Castin Velorum System, Cygni Branch. After a few minutes of staring in disbelief, Jack had pressed the acceleration pedal and continued off down the path toward home. He felt sick the entire way. He could feel the anxiousness building in him with each rock he haphazardly ran over. How was he going to explain what he had just seen? It would kill him. To know that it was there and they had missed it might just be enough to break the old man. But he had to tell someone. It looked like there might have been some left. The scraps, no doubt, but some. And a little of that could go a long way. Maybe Anna could get a ticket on a transport ship and new lungs from a war-world medical facility. Or maybe they could buy a new set of mining drones. That's how valuable even a small amount lerasum was. He ran over it again and again in his mind. What would he say? How would the old man react? Every different way that this could go, he thought it through, running through how the various members of his family might react in his mind. He was lucky it was a long ride, but there were no good outcomes here. He was the bearer of bad news. It wasn't death, but it was the closest thing. At least the family knew death. This, they didn't. His mind raced. As the lights from the outside of the old, rusted transport ship they called home became visible across the plains in the distance, he could feel himself chickening out. He wouldn't tell them tonight. He'd sleep on it, think it through some more. Then he could explain clearly what he saw in the morning. He parked the buggy and chained it up to the tail-repurposed ship that they used as a home, next to the other buggies and the mining drones that were waiting to be switched on come morning. Grandpa had bought the old transport ship at an auction about 50 years previous. It didn't fly, and hadn't when it had purchased it either. He had always intended it to be a temporary home for the family. Eventually, it had become a permanent home. He leaned against the ship for a moment, angry and confused, letting the cold metal exterior grate cool his already freezing face. How am I going to tell anyone about this? It will ruin everything. All he could think about was his sister, Anna, and how much this would have meant for her. She was this close to a new set of lungs. This is going to destroy her. Jack opened the creaky front door, shut it behind him, and locked it. He started disrobing. His clothes were certain to be filled with sand that the wind had whipped into the crevices. He'd leave them outside, and maybe Anna, his sister, could wash them in the morning. He stepped inside. Directly to the right of the front door was the open living area where the family spent most of their time when they weren't mining. The old man was asleep in his reclining chair inside what would have been the common room when the ship was operational and now had become the television feed room, arms folded on his lap, snoring his way through what sounded like a not-so-sound sleep. Jack grabbed a blanket off of the couch next to him and threw it over him. He slept out here most nights. Jack made his way to the kitchen, his stomach in knots. Every surface was metallic, built to stand the test of years floating out in the black. He didn't want to have to tell him, but he couldn't keep it a secret. He knew that much. Someone else would find it eventually. Probably the old man himself. He couldn't let him find out that way. He made his way down the hallway toward their quarters and peeked his head into Anna's room. She was laying in bed, looking at a network hologram show on her bed. She saw him out of the corner of her eye. "Hey," she said. "Hey," Jack said, forcing a soft smile. "Did you have a good day?" "Better than most. I didn't have to go outside at all today, so my breathing was all right. A little worse after dinner, but it's always like that." "Good," Jack said as he rapped his knuckles against the metal wall of her quarters. "Someday, Anna, someday we will get you new lungs." She furrowed her brow, confused by why he would bring it up so randomly, then cast it aside and nodded before returning her attention back to her show. Why even bring it up? Now it's going to be weird after she finds out about the lerasum tomorrow. The house was quiet. That meant that Jar and Val, Jack brothers, weren't home. And that meant that they were almost surely at the bar, a dusty old hole in the wall in town, about 15 minutes on a buggy from their home. Jack's feet clanked against the metallic floors as he walked toward the front of the ship, which was the back of their house, where his bedroom was located. He went into his room and shut the door behind him before collapsing on his bed. His room was plain, with barely any posters or decorations hanging on the walls like you might expect for a man of his age, but it was clean. Thoughts of what he was going to have to do polluted his mind. He wanted to act as if he had never seen it, but he couldn't. He was going to have to tell them, no matter where it went. Jack waited for his mind to settle enough to allow him to sleep. Chapter 3. Calin Homeship, Planet Castin Velorum System, Signy Branch. Jack never woke up that morning. He had never been asleep. He could hear several people in the kitchen banging pots and pans. His brothers were up, which was surprising given that he had never heard them come home the night before. Just do it. Get it out of the way. Jack sighed a heavy sigh. No use in putting it off any longer. If this blows everything up, at least there was truly nothing that I could do about it. He had to let them know the truth. He pulled on some pants and a t-shirt and didn't bother with work clothes. As soon as he told everyone about it, they were going to want to go see it. There wouldn't be any work today. He took his time, trying to give himself any second he could to find another solution other than telling them. But there was none. He walked out to the kitchen and found the old man sitting at the metal dining table drinking coffee, his white beard with beads of coffee stuck in the mustache. His brothers were in the kitchen working around each other to fix what appeared to be oatmeal and some kind of mushroom sausage. He took a deep breath. "I need you guys to listen," he said. "What?" "Jar," his brother said. "You finally fucked the Warson girl?" Jar was 4 years Jack's senior and much stronger. His rippled muscles were always visible through the cut-off tank tops that he wore whenever the temperature would allow. "It's serious," Jack said, trying to impress the importance of what he was about to say with his tone. Val, for once, took his cue and didn't push back. "I found something while I was doing the perimeter check last night. You guys aren't going to like it." The old man looked up from his comm unit. "Well, out with it." "I found a lerasum vein at the north side of the property, on the trail that juts off just before the north property line. It was all mined out, just scraps left." The room was silent for a moment. "The hell you did," Jar said. "What?" the old man said. "Grandpa, don't listen to this idiot. He wouldn't know a lerasum vein if it hit him on the head," Jar said, giving a wave of dismissal in Jack's direction. "It was probably something else," Val said from behind the long brown hair that shrouded his face. "Shut up, you two," Grandpa said as he pulled himself to his feet and waddled his way over to Jack. "Now tell me exactly what you mean. Why do you think you found lerasum?" "It was green," Jack responded. "Glowing?" Grandpa asked. "Glowing. But you said it was gone?" "Yes, well, mostly. There were some scraps left. I came across it just off the buggy road up by the dip just after you crossed the creek there. I saw it glowing in the distance. When I got closer, I could see that it was lerasum. But it was mostly gone, and there were mining torch burns all around it." The old man held his gaze for a moment, as if he was trying to get a feel for whether he was fucking with him. Jack gave him nothing that told him he was, and he saw the life sink from his eyes. He backed up and slowly sat back down where he had been, placed his elbows on his knees, and stared at the ground in front of him. No one said anything for a moment. They all waited for the old man to break the silence. "Jar, Val, go out there with Jack again. See what he found. Make sure it is what he says it is." "Do you don't want to go?" Jack asked. "No," the old man said without looking up from the ground. "If someone found a vein of lerasum on our property and took it from us, I don't think that I could bear it." Chapter 4. Calin Homestead, Planet Castin Velorum System, Signy Branch. Jack and his brothers had hopped on the speedier of the buggies and took off toward the northern property line in the mountains. Val and Jar badgered Jack the entire ride out there. It wasn't lerasum, that they were sure of. He was an idiot, or had been confused. The night had played tricks on him. Anything other than the truth. that he had found a freshly mined vein of lerasum in the hillside, and they were never going to get it back. Jar was particularly difficult to deal with. Jar had always been the one that always had to be right. His aggressive personality made him difficult to deal with, so Jack just decided that he would let them see for themselves and not try to convince them. They thought he was an idiot. But he had been 10 years old when the Volsniks had found their lerasum vein on their homestead about 10 miles away. They had invited all of the neighboring homesteads over to see it for themselves, and the entire Calin family had gone. He couldn't help but remember how it had looked. It was the only rock he had ever seen that glowed. They had left a few weeks later, and they hadn't seen the Volsniks since. Their plan had been to move into the core systems and live an easy life. He often thought about them, and their boy, Hemi, that had been his friend, and wondered if they had made out all right. Lerasum was an exceptionally strong metal with an extremely high melting point. It was used to augment ship plating, environment domes, and in ship reactors, to name a few. But it was rare, at least in this part of the galaxy. To find a lerasum vein, if it was of at least decent quality, could mean that your children and your children's children and their children would live easy lives. A big vein could go several generations farther, and from what Jack had seen, this had likely been on the bigger side. Jack hung off the back of the buggy, his goggles placed firmly on his face to keep the sand out of his eyes. It was even bumpier than it was riding in the front. Val was driving, his long brown hair getting in his way as he drove. "There is no chance in hell there is lerasum up here," Jar said. "Do you know how many times Grandpa had this place surveyed? The mountains are dead." "He missed something," Jack said bluntly. They continued attempting to argue with him for the majority of the ride there. Finally, when they crossed the bridge and came around the bend, they took the trail that jutted off the main. A few minutes later, Jack pointed to a faint green glow in the distance. "There!" They continued to roll toward it. "For fuck's sake," Val said. The glow was unmistakable if you had seen it before. There was nothing in nature, at least here on Castin, that had that look except for lerasum. They pulled up alongside the carved hillside and hopped out of the buggy. They stared in silence. They stared, their mouths hanging open. After a minute, Jar made his way down into the carved-out hillside where the vein had once been. It was about 20 feet deep and 6 feet across. He rubbed his hands along the walls. He whipped around. "This is fresh." "Fresh? How fresh?" Val responded. "Too fucking fresh. A day. Maybe 2 or 3. "Wait, you're saying that whoever did this, they were up here mining this out in the last few days?" Jack responded. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Jar said. "And what do you mean whoever did this? Who the fuck do you think did this?" "My money's on Castin," Val said. Jack didn't really give it too much thought. Val had had an ongoing beef with Castin, but the guy was too stupid to pull something like this off. Jar rolled his eyes. "Anyone who did this would need drones that are equipped to even mine lerasum. It isn't exactly the easiest thing to mine, and they'd need a lot of them to do it quickly," said Val as he rubbed his hand on the glowing green metal. "It really is beautiful." "Look at this fucking hole," Jar said, his arms outstretched toward the hillside that had been carved away. "How much do you think was in here, Val?" He thought about it for a moment. "Well, I've never mined lerasum, obviously, but if it was anything like titanium, I'd say a ton, maybe more." Jack's mouth dropped. A ton? As in 1,000 kilograms? "It's a guess." Jar kicked the dirt in front of him. "A ton! A fucking ton! Lerasum goes for 100,000 credits a kilogram. Jack, how much is that?" "It's 100 million credits." Jar's eyes went wide. Val let out a moan and fell to his knees. For a second, Jack thought that he might weep into his hands. They sat in silence for a few moments, taking the number in. 100 million credits. That is enough money to get Anna a new set of lungs and live rich for the next 5 generations. That's enough for some future relative that I'd never even meet to blow and be famous for it. "We can't tell Grandpa," Jack said. "Tell him what? Of course we have to tell him. He sent us out here." "No, the amount. Let's just tell him it looked like a small vein. He said he would never want to come out here and see it. Let's not let him think that he missed out on his jackpot after being here for 60 years. "He's going to feel like that no matter what," Val replied. "Plus, there is still mineable lerasum here. We can't just leave this shit sitting here. Do we have anything that can even mine it? Jack asked, knowing the answer. No, Val replied solemnly. The sun was high in the sky when they started heading back toward home. Val had been quiet the whole ride home. Jar less so, but even he was somewhat restrained from his typical self. The buggy kicked up dust as it jostled around on the rocky plains heading back for home. We're going to kill them, Val said, as soon as we figure out who it is. Jar said. Figure out who it is? We know who it is. I wouldn't be so quick to cast blame. This could have been anyone, Jack said. Oh, please, we share the goddamn property line with them, Jack. That vein wasn't more than a 10-minute drive from their property line. We know who is responsible. We also share a property line with the Carsons. And the Dairns, if you want to get technical, Jack said. The Dairns are on the other side of the fucking mountains, Jack. It wasn't the Dairns. How are they even going to get their mining drones over here? Jack thought for a moment. That's a good point. Air drones, he said. It would be small trips and take them a while, but who knows how long it was being mined. We haven't been out there for almost 6 months. Air drones? Val said, turning around and whipping his hair against the back of his head. Seriously? You think they sent dozens, maybe hundreds of air drones over those mountains to carry the lerasum back a piece at a time? No. It was either the Carsons or the Vilges, but I don't think the Carsons would do that. That's fucking right, Jar interjected forcefully. Okay, no, probably not. Even so, we can't just go accusing the Vilges. If we can't find where they have it, we have no proof that they did it, and we won't get it back. We have to go about this smart, Jack said. Smart my ass, Jar said, beating his fist against the dash. We need to go over there and take it. Those fucks have been getting the better of our family for decades. Now they are going to take our wealth, our fucking birthright. Jar had a point. The Vilge clan was about the worst people that Jack had ever met. They shared a property line on the northwest side of the Calin property, and they had had run-ins throughout the years. The eldest Vilge, Canov, was a tough, leathery old man who listened to no one. Over the years, Grandpa had learned not to push too far with him as he bit back. They squabbled over land ownership, land maintenance, and pricing. Since they both largely mined iron and platinum on their properties, they often butted heads over supply levels and shipment times. When they both shipped together, they got lower prices at the port. Crossing the boundaries and mining the lerasum was too in character for the Vilges. It made too much sense. But it wasn't good news. They were the type to do anything to hang on to it, which meant that they were going to have a hell of a time getting the lerasum back. Chapter 5. Calin Hyomi Ship, Planet Castin Velorum System, Signy Branch. Grandpa grabbed the small of his back as he bent over to pick up the kindling that lay next to the fire pit outside of the rusted transport ship that he called home. He felt a hole in his chest as he carefully prepared the kindling into a precisely stacked teepee on top of the wild brush that he had pulled from the ground. It had been a while since he had felt like this. Or maybe he felt like this all the time. It was hard to know. He had tried for decades to push his failures out of his mind. He had become pretty adept at it, too, able to continue on living despite the unbearable weight of his mistakes. But this mistake would outweigh them all if it turned out to be true. It was something else, too much for his spirit. It dragged it all back up in all of the worst ways, the stench of failure that he felt encircling him every single day. A life wasted, a whole family's lives wasted because he made the wrong call. He should never have moved to this god-forsaken planet. When the ring had first opened to the Velorum System, there had been such promise. An asteroid belt that contained an array of metals and minerals, along with a mountainous planet that early scans had flagged as littered with a wealth of deposits. There had been a lot of buzz about the Velorum System. There had been a gold rush of sorts to claim homesteads there from the moment the ring gate to the system had opened. Of course, no one was actually interested in gold so much anymore. But platinum, iridium, palladium, osmium, ruthenium, rhodium, and with some luck, lerasum. Those were the metals that people were chasing when they came to Velorum. And Castin, the planet where the Calin clan had ultimately settled, was supposed to be the hotspot in the entire system. Early scans and test-run mining operations had found rich deposits of iridium, platinum, and ruthenium. Of course, mining down a gravity well wasn't ideal for large corporations. They would much rather stick to asteroids and low-gravity environments where the mining was cheap. But for a family, it was a huge opportunity. Then, about 2 years after the ring gate opened and while initial homesteads were still being parceled out, the Kelowna Mining Company found the richest lerasum deposit that had ever been discovered. Tens of thousands of tons of lerasum were discovered not farther than 250 miles from where the Calin homestead would eventually be located. Interest in relocating to Velorum. I skyrocketed overnight. The old man hadn't originally planned to relocate to the Velorum System from Colat, where he had been born. But two events happened simultaneously that made it too good to pass up. First, his grandfather had died, leaving him with more than 350,000 credits. It was a decent amount, large enough for him to live a pretty decent, simple life for a long time without working. But he had just found out his wife, Svana, was pregnant with their first child, and he wanted more for them. The second event was that a friend of his, Nestor, another miner for Vanna Mining Corp., had bought a homestead ticket to Velorum before his mother had fallen ill, and he had decided to stay in the Colat system. The tickets were in incredibly high demand. Nestor had received his through a lottery. Nestor was asking for 175,000 credits for the rights to a homestead in the northernmost quadrant of the main continent on Castin. The old man, then young, had enough to cover the ticket and the startup equipment that he would need to get mining. Within 3 months, he and Svana had relocated. He bought an old ship, which had since been replaced with a newer but equally worn ship, to use as a home. It was waiting for them, hooked up to a power and waste source on their homestead, when they arrived, and he began mining. Things were good, for a spell. The easily identified veins had made their first few years plentiful. The problem was that everyone's first years were plentiful as well. The plot of land had been somewhat rich with platinum and iridium. At the time, he had also had high hopes that he would one day find lerasum in the mountains on his property. But soon the easily mined veins were running thin. Drilling into the thick shale ground of the plains or mountainous region was grueling work. It was worth it if he had a lead on some lerasum, but generally avoided doing so for titanium in those early days. Of course, now, with less to mine, it was commonplace. About 15 years after the ring to Velorum opened, the ring gate from Velorum to Eridani opened. Initial deep scans had showed a high likelihood of several mineral-rich asteroids and moons, along with a planet that appeared to be a solid candidate for colonization. As it turned out, Eridani was that and more. Rich iridium deposits littered the two gigantic asteroid belts that orbited the system's star. Large lerasum deposits were found on several moons, and so the interest in Velorum quickly waned. What had been seen as a gold rush system was quickly overshadowed and left to rot. The years had dragged on, and the lerasum never came. Never a single vein. And he had to live with it. The shame. The shame of knowing that he had chosen a planet that was barren. Of knowing that he had started a family somewhere that they could never prosper. And on a whim at that. He lit the small scraps of paper that he was able to put together and lit the kindling ablaze. He watched as the flames enveloped the kindling and then set a larger piece down on top. He watched until it was enveloped. He felt blank, as if his body contains no emotion. You would have thought that there would be sadness there. But there was nothing. Only the lingering stench of failure resonated deeply into his core. "Hi, Papa," Anna said as she approached the fire that had now grown into a roaring small bonfire. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," the old man said, shuffling one of the fire logs until it was just right. They sat in silence for a moment, taking in the small fire on the sandy floor of the Castin desert. "You know," the old man said, not looking up from the logs, "that lerasum would have bought you new lungs. It would have gotten us off of this god-forsaken planet." Anna nodded and sat in silence for a moment, thinking of how best to respond. "It's okay, Papa, you didn't know," Anna said, grabbing his hand. "It doesn't matter. I wasn't good enough. It was there under my feet the whole time. I spent my whole life, and bet the lives of my family, on this planet. And it was always there. Our ticket to heaven. And I missed it." Anna buried her face into his side. She meant to comfort him, but he felt nothing. "Go inside, please, Anna," the old man said through tears, before your breathing starts acting up. Fued. A Pocket's Universe Story. Episode 2. Chapter 6. Calin Homeship. Planet Castin. Velorum System. Signy Branch. I say we wait at the vein, Val said as he held his hand flat, facing upward above the metal table in the kitchen. There's still scraps left there. Not much, but enough to not want to leave it behind. I say we sit up on the hillside opposite of it, across the road, and ambush them the next time they come. They probably mined it under the cover of darkness, too much risk otherwise. I'm willing to bet that they do it again. It wasn't a half-bad idea. He was right. There wasn't much left. But there was probably enough there to feed the family for a few years without worry. It made sense that someone would come back for it. They are never coming back, Jar replied. Who knows how much they got? What's left probably isn't much more than 0.1% of what they took. If they took enough, 0.1% goes pretty far, Jack said. Nah, Jar said. Too much risk for them to come back. Not for that much. They are sitting pretty. Instead of waiting out there and freezing our asses off for a bunch of mining drones that will never come, I say we go over there and confront them. Who? Jar laughed. Who? You really are dense, aren't you, Jack? Vilge and his messed up kids. We do know that they did it. There isn't anyone else. And if it is someone else, we're never going to be able to catch them anyway. I say we go over there and shove a barrel of a rifle down their mouths and see what they have to say about it. That's too far, the old man chimed in from the back of the room, his voice shaky. You do that and our families are at war whether we are right or wrong. So? War means dead kids of mine, one of you, or all of you. If there ever is something worth going to war over, lerasum might just be it. But we have to be right. Exactly, Jack piped in. We need to do some more research. Ask around and see what we can learn. I agree with you that it is more than likely the Vilges. They'd be the most likely to do it. Anyone would be likely to do it, the old man said. It's lerasum. True, Jack said. Still, we should find out what we can. Find out what? Jar said, exasperated. You think old man Vilge went into town and told everyone that he found a vein of lerasum on our property? No, probably not, Jack said. Then we will go to their place tonight. Wait until they are all asleep and then storm the place. Their compound is a run-down old shack. It won't take us long. Enough, Grandpa said. We won't do that. Not yet, anyway. For tonight, we wait. Tomorrow, first thing in the morning, Jack, you go talk to Lavernus. If anyone would have heard anything or noticed anything different, it would be him. Tonight, stake out the vein and see if anyone comes. Until we have some kind of evidence, we aren't doing anything to anybody. Understood? Yes, sir, Jar responded before briskly marching out of the room. Chapter 7. Born. Planet Castin. Velorum System. Signy Branch. That next morning, Jack woke up, got dressed, and immediately hopped on the solar buggy to make his way to Bourne, the nearest town. It was about 10 kilometers away down a dirt road. He could have taken the sand speeder, which was much faster, but had opted to give himself some time to think about things. The morning on Castin was Jack's favorite. They were always crystal clear. It wasn't yet hot enough to be uncomfortable, and often the dew gave the limited plant life a unique shine that lent the otherwise boring landscape a magical glow. Jack had made the drive hundreds, maybe thousands of times. Bourne was a small mining community that had sprouted up during the earliest homesteads. Since this region never really materialized into what they were hoping for, only a few small towns, each one similar to the others, were within 500 miles of Bourne. Bourne had its own rustic charm, with about 5,000 people living within the limits of the city, which stretched for miles into the homesteads. There was a grocery, a mining supply store, a two-street residential area, and 2 bars in town. They had only bothered to pave Main Street. He pulled up to the mining supply store. The old metal structure was immaculately cared for compared to the other handful of sand-swept buildings in Bourne. Aside from a few early morning drunks loitering outside of the bar, there was no one in sight. He walked in, and behind the counter was Lavernus Apoche, an early 50s man with a white beard who had come to Castin nearly 30 years before to take care of his ailing uncle, who had run the store before him and was much less pleasant to be around. "Ahoy, Jack," he said with a smile and a pile of metal parts on the counter in front of him. "What do you need this early in the morning? Mining drone breakdown again?" "No, not exactly," Jack replied, and Lavernus perked up a bit in his seat. Jack took a quick look around the store to make sure no one was within earshot, going as far as to take a few steps to peer down the middle aisle, which led out into the shop where all of the heavy machinery was stored. "Has anyone come in here spending a lot of money lately? Like, a surprising amount of money?" Lavernus squinted. "Why? You know I can't—" "We found a lerasum vein." "What?" Lavernus shouted, jumping up from his seat. "But it's mined out, at the edges of our property. Judging by the charring, it looks like it was freshly mined." "Get out of town," Lavernus said, his eyes wide. "You're saying that you guys didn't mine it? Someone else did?" "Yes." "Who?" "That's why I'm asking. We just found it. I'm trying to get a beat on who it might have been." Lavernus dropped his head and fiddled with the metal pieces in front of him. He made quick eye contact with Jack but couldn't hold it. "Lavernus, what is it?" "I can't, Jack. They're customers." "It's lerasum, Lavernus. And not a little bit of it either. A lot of it." "Humph," the old man said, squeezing the metal gears. "If you could guess it." "Vilge?" Lavernus looked surprised. "Oh, perhaps I shouldn't have made that offer. But, yeah, his eldest grandson might have been in here the other day, not buying stuff exactly, but the opposite." "He was selling stuff?" "Well, sold. I bought quite a bit from him, and at too low of a price. I knew that it was too good to be true," Lavernus said, wringing his hands nervously. "So what are you saying?" He chuckled lightly under his breath. "Ah, fine. They sold all of their mining equipment and told me that they were going to sell the homestead and move away. Now, why would they want to do that? I thought the whole thing was off. Don't you see, boy?" Lavernus pleaded. "Oh, shit," Jack replied, the reality of the situation washing over him like a sandstorm. "Yeah, shit. And here I am profiting off of them stealing your shit," Lavernus said with intentional alliteration. "Well, we don't know for sure that it was them," Jack said. "Oh, please, yes, we do. What else would make the bilges up and sell all of their equipment and move away on a whim? That family is as Castin as could be. They are lifers, Jack. I would have thought you would have had to drag them out of here at gunpoint, that nasty old man. Unless they just fell into a bunch of money and are now off to live the good life," Jack said solemnly. He knew what that meant. Chapter 8. Calin Homeship, Planet Castin, Velorum System, Signy Branch. Jack wasn't going to be happy to admit that Jar had likely been right all along, that it was the bilges. He had hoped, somewhere deep down inside, that it wouldn't be them, even though they were the obvious choice. But their nasty disposition held true. Based on what Lavernus had said, Jack was reasonably sure that it was them. Lavernus was right. They wouldn't sell everything and leave town unless something big had happened. He returned home to find everyone sitting in the kitchen in silence. The idea of doing any sort of mining while the stolen lerasum was hanging over their heads was a non-starter. Jack cleared his throat, but no one looked in his direction. "I spoke with Lavernus. He said the bilges recently came in and sold off all of their equipment for dirt cheap." They sat in stunned silence for a moment, taking in what exactly that meant. "I fucking told you!" Jar yelled as he brought his fist down onto their dining room table. "They should fucking die for this!" Yeah, Jack could hardly deny his point. It was them, and they had taken too much to forgive. They had taken Anna's chance at a new life. They had taken his family's right to shape their future and live any life that they wanted. And wasn't that everything, really? "I'll get the weapons," Val said and began walking out of the kitchen. "Wait," the old man said weakly from his seat, stopping Val in his tracks. "Not yet." "But we know it's them," Jar retorted. "No, you don't. You suspect, and you have good reason to, but we don't know," the old man said. "I mean, I guess," Val said, shrugging. "But who else would it be, Grandpa?" "No one. It's them, and we all know it. But we can't just go over there and demand they give it to us. They aren't going to do that. Besides, how do we even know that it is still on the planet? Maybe they have already sold it?" Jack asked. "You said that they were just in the shop the other day selling everything?" Grandpa asked. Yes. Then it's still here. They would need some startup capital to transport the lerasum before they can get it off-world and sell it. They don't have a ship. I know that. They're going to have to pay for transport with someone, and they will have to tell them what they have. Can't hide a ton of glowing green rocks, which means that they are probably going to have to offer them a cut to do that. Knowing Bilge, he's not going to like that. He also won't like having to let someone know that they have it, the old man said. So, Jar said, knowing all of that, how do we use that to our advantage? We watch them, Anna said from the kitchen doorway, surprising Jack. He hated that she was so aware of what was going on and the opportunity that she had lost. She had enough on her plate already. They are probably hiding the lerasum, right? They wouldn't keep it somewhere where someone could just stumble across it. And their property isn't very big. There's not a lot of places to keep it hidden. And worst-case scenario, we find out where it is right as they go to move it, and then we can make our move. I could go into town tomorrow and use some of the savings to buy a few surveillance drones. Between us and some drones, we could watch every move that they make and put a plan together, Jack said. Val and Jar made eye contact. Jar nodded. I like it. Be smart about it. Don't go in guns blazing, I get it. Grandpa? The old man nodded. Find the lerasum first, then we take it back. Chapter 9. Lavernus's Shop, Planet Castin, Velorum System, Signy Branch. The next morning, just before the sun rose, Jack departed on the buggy with a trailer hitched to the back. It bounced and banged as he made his way down the potholed dirt road to town. He was betting that Lavernus would be there. Technically, his store didn't open for another couple of hours, but had never shown up and found the store empty. In fact, now that he thought about it, he wondered if Lavernus actually lived there on a cot or something. Maybe the sofa had a fold-out bed. He had never seen his home or bothered to ask him where it was. On the 15-minute ride, it was hard to think about anything else other than the bilges and the lerasum. Had they found it themselves, it would have been a life-changing event. He was sure that it was for the bilges, too. Bastards! He considered how he would have reacted if he were in their position. If he had stumbled across a lerasum vein over their own property line, what would he have done? Would he have told the owner that he had found it? He liked to think so. That was what good person would do. If the bilges had shown up at their door and let them know about the vein, they would have given them a finder's fee that would have made them beyond rich. But on the other hand, would he be doing a disservice to his family? He would on some level, denying them a payday that would change their lives and maybe tens of generations to follow. By the time he was pulling into the shop parking lot, he still hadn't made up his mind. He stepped out of the buggy, checked on the small metal trailer that wasn't much more than a welded box with wheels, and walked through the front door. The virtual bell dinged as he did, and Lavernus popped his head around the corner. You again, he said. Early again, too, Lavernus said with his patented smile. Yeah, I'm sorry I know you're not open this early, but I figured. Nonsense, boy. How can I help? I need some drones, surveillance drones, Jack said with conviction. Lavernus raised an eyebrow. Surveillance drones? And what do you plan on surveilling? Our property. Maybe the surrounding area, Jack said with a sly smile. So you are looking for something that flies very high and has a solid camera with a deep zoom? Yeah, I don't know exactly. That sounds good, though. What other kind of features are there? Well, anything, really. I can flash update the software. Might take a couple of hours as I have to do it via Lightbeam, as obviously the Capterra Drone Corporation doesn't have servers on Castin. But just about every drone is capable of that. I see. Well, I don't think we need anything special. We just need to scout a few things and make sure people don't leave the area in the middle of the night. What is the flight time on these things? Well, they fly until you tell them to come down. Just send them up in the morning and give them time to bake in the sun. We have more than enough solar power for these things to stay in the air. And I can tell it to follow or person or patrol a certain area? Jack asked. Yes, I can show you how if you'd like. That's okay. I think I can figure it out, Jack said. This was good news. It meant that they could handle business without being glued to the drone's controls. All right, let me go in the back and pull them out. They are pretty big, so I will pull them out on the wagon, Lavernus said as he waddled his way through the aisle back to the storage room. Great. Thank you, Lavernus. And oh, yay, how much? Jack said, pulling out his device and getting ready to transfer them over. It's on the house, boy. Lavernus, no, that's way too much. Nonsense. Your family just had your birthright stolen. I'd love to help you all get even a piece of it back. Thank you, Jack said, and gave Lavernus an appreciative head nod and eye contact. Lavernus returned the nod. A few minutes later, the 3 drones had been loaded into and on top of the trailer behind the buggy. They were much bigger than Jack had anticipated. But he figured that made sense. They needed to soar. They were going to fold out to be more than 5 feet wide. All set, Lavernus said as he latched the last trailer cover cord on the bottom side of the trailer. Thank you, Jack replied, nodded, and turned to leave. And, Jack, one more thing, it's not really my place to say this, but I feel like I must. The Bilges, they are not a clan to be trifled with. If they did what you think and stole from you, they are going to die protecting it. If you're going to go after it, you risk doing the same. Your whole family does. Jack squinted as the rising sun hit his face for the first time. I know, he said before patting Lavernus on the back and taking off down the dirt path toward their old, rusted home ship. Chapter 10. Calin home ship. Planet Castin. Velorum System. Signy branch. They had the drones in the air within an hour of Jack returning home. 3 of them. They were no more than a foot wide when they weren't in glide mode and flew at 10,000 meters, making them undetectable to anyone on the ground that wasn't looking for them through a scope. Still, the zoom lens on the drone was good enough that you could zoom in on someone on the ground and see whether a person bit their nails or not. He, Val, and Jar sat around the kitchen table, watching the views from the drones on the tabletop screen as they got a lay of the land. The first person they spotted was Gar, the youngest son in the Bilge clan. There were 3 boys ranging in age from 16 to 34, Gar, Karun, and Gentry. There was a sister, Elm, who was the second oldest. Then there was the old man, Caro. He was a mean old bastard. His skin was browned leather, hanging from his bones from years of working out in the hot Castin sun. Gar was putting around the house when they saw him, messing with what looked like a motorcycle engine. Occasionally, someone else from the home would step outside to smoke a cigarette. But that was it. No one out on the property. No mining drones running back and forth. No buggies puttering around. Caro Bilge had never been the type of man to take a day off either. They watched them for a few hours, intently at first. About an hour into surveillance, Gentry made his way into town on the buggy and stopped at the bar for about an hour. Then he drove directly back home. It was quiet. Occasionally, Jack would pull a drone from their post and take a quick peek around the Bilge property. He looked for anything that might indicate anything. He checked for minging drone trails that might have shown where the lerasum had been deposited, but didn't have any luck. If they had moved it recently, they had done a good job of covering their tracks. More likely was that they had moved it some time ago. There weren't a lot of places on the property where they could keep the lerasum either. There was their residence, a loosely connected system of trailers that had metal welded onto the whole of the outside of the house to help it weather the occasional sandstorm. But the home was tight for the number of people that lived there, let alone potentially several tons of lerasum. There was a shed about 30 meters behind the house. It was too small. There was a covered equipment area that was quite large but didn't have walls, just a metal roof covering. Not really the kind of place Theta you would store stolen lerasum. There was also a barn. If they were keeping it on the property, it was probably there. But that would be kind of obvious, they thought. But it really seemed like the only good option. Of course, the barn wasn't well constructed. You'd expect to see the green glow at the entrance of the metallic barn, so there was no telling where they were keeping it. It could be on their property. It could be elsewhere. They were just going to have to wait to see where they moved to get an idea of where it might be. But then there was the prospect that they may suspect that they were being watched. They may have had their own surveillance drones who had watched Jack discover the vein. There was no telling how much they knew. If it had been him, Jack would have been as safe as possible. He would have been watching. But whether the Bilges would be that thorough, he wasn't sure. Jacht ticked on. Occasionally, Grandpa would wander into the kitchen and stare silently at the drone feeds, before walking back out to the living room and watching his shows. He didn't seem bothered by it, but hadn't shown much emotion at all since they had discovered what had happened. They all took up their own activities and watched the feed more passively as the night went on. Eventually, Jar announced that he was going to bed. "If anything happens, we can run the feeds back in the morning." He was right. They hadn't left the home all day. They weren't even sure if they were all in the home because one of the sons had never appeared. They were absolutely laying low. He figured it was safe to sleep, but a feeling in the pit of his stomach told him to wait. Before long, he got his answer. Jack noticed a pair of headlights come on outside the home deep into the night. The drone noted the movement, switched to night vision mode, and followed a buggy as the youngest son, Gar, took off westward. He watched for a moment as he weaved his way through the trails. "Hey!" Jack said, motioning for Jar to come look at the screen. They watched in silence as he winded his way away from the bilge property up into the northwest mountains. He continued on that path for a few minutes, and soon there was no denying it. "He's going to the vein!" Jack said excitedly. Grandpa appeared behind them almost instantly. "Go grab him!" Fued, A Pockets Universe Story, Episode 3, Chapter 11, Calin Homestead, Planet Castin, Velorum System, Signy Branch. In less than 2 minutes, they had woken Val up, loaded the buggy, and hit the trail as fast as it would take them. There weren't a whole lot of reasons for him to be heading out there this late than to try to pull some more lerasum out of the hillside. If they could catch him in the act and take him, their chances of getting at least some of their lerasum back skyrocketed. Luckily, they realized early on where he was heading and were going to be able to beat him there by just a few minutes. He had a longer drive coming over from the bilge property. They set up on the opposing hillside in a little nook, parking the buggy off of the path about a quarter-mile away. It would take them less than a minute to close on Gar when he arrived. They waited. The anticipation was killing him. A few minutes later, the headlights appeared far down the path, beyond the bridge in the distance. He slowly made his way closer and pulled up on the side of the road near the ditch where the vein had been carved out of the mountainside. He exited the buggy and quickly descended the dip toward the vein. He was wearing a metallic backpack-like device that Jack immediately recognized as a mobile drill. "The fucker is back for a final taste," Jar said, his teeth clenched. They waited until he was set up and drilling into the glowing material, hoping that the noise from the drill would mask their movement. They crept slowly, making their way down the face of the hillside opposite from him. When they reached the path, they ducked as he stopped drilling and wiped at the surface with his gloves. Jack didn't dare move. Seconds later, he started drilling again. They crossed the dirt path and closed the gap quickly. They stopped worrying about the noise that they made. As they approached, Gar began to hear the sound of rock shuffling behind him. He cut the power to his drill and turned around just in time to see a crowbar hit him in the goggles. Chapter 12, Calin Homestead, Planet Castin, Velorum System, Signy Branch. Jack sat in front of Gar, watching over him with his pistol as the youngest bilge son started to open his eyes. His forehead had been split open and they had used liquid bandage to close it up, which they kept in every vehicle on the property. Scrapes and cuts were common in a backwater mining operation that required a little elbow grease to get the drones working correctly most days. They arrived back at the home ship and carried him in, tying him to a bed in the back room of the ship. He had been in and out of consciousness for hours. They had worried that Jar had killed him, which would have been a disaster and ensured that there would be all-out war between the families. But with him alive, they had something worth bartering. Gar survived. Barely. When he woke, it was clear from the look on his face that his head was pounding. He was still tied to the bed, each appendage tied to a different corner of the bed, with Gar unable to move much at all. "Sorry he whacked you so hard," Jack said. Gar moaned. Who hit me? Where am I?" "You don't recognize me?" Jack asked. "No," Gar responded through his delirium. "All right, we'll get to that when my brothers get here," Jack said. "Brothers?" "Yes, my brothers Jar and Val." "Oh, I know where I am now," Gar responded. "That's good," Jack said. He knew that he was supposed to be scaring him right now, but that wasn't Jack's way. Being intimidating was for his brothers. Jack just didn't have it in him. A second later, Val and Jar walked through the door. He's up, Jar said in a cheery voice. How are you feeling, old boy? I've been fucking better, Jar, you shyesty fuck, Gar responded groggily. Oh, me? I'm the shyesty fuck? What were you mining out there on our property exactly? Jar responded. The youngest bilge son didn't say anything. I thought so. So here's the deal, Val said. We're going to trade you for our lerasum back. The message is already sent to your old man that we caught you doing it and we have you. All cards on the table as far as I'm concerned. Gar stared blankly for a second before breaking into a deep belly laugh. Val, Jar, and Jack made awkward eye contact. What's so fucking funny? Jar said as he picked up the crowbar off of the bedside table and raised it. Y'all are so damn dumb, that's all, Gar said. Do you think my old man is going to take kindly to this? You think we took your lerasum? Okay, all right, I don't know anything about that, but my old man is going to kill every last one of you for taking me. We'll see, Jar said as he punched him in the face. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It was a few hours later when the buggy pulled up in front of their home. They hadn't expected the old man to take his sweet time after receiving the message, but apparently he was in no rush to get his son back. He had come alone. He exited the vehicle slowly and stood beside it, waiting for them to come out and meet him there. They did. I got your message, Old Man Bilge said, spitting black spit on the rock beside him. At least I think it was yours. Did you send that old man? I did. I authorized it, Grandpa responded with confidence. That's a shame. What do you mean by that? Jar injected. It's a shame that y'all would engage in conspiracies like that and go as far as to kidnap my son. Have you been hitting the bottle? Old Man Bilge asked sarcastically. We caught him red-handed, Grandpa said, mining the scraps of a lerasum vein on our property. He drove right to it and knew where it was. You can't tell me it wasn't you, Bilge. I don't know a good goddamn about whatever you are talking about. Whatever you're accusing me of, you can go fuck yourself. You have 2 days to release my son, and he better be in one piece. If he doesn't come walking his ass back into our home by then, I'm coming back here to get him, and I will kill every last one of y'all to do it. Then, just as quickly as he had arrived, he hopped back into the buggy, peeled around kicking up rocks and dirt, and shot off back into the night. Fuck, Val said. Chapter 12. Calin Homestead. Planet Castin. Velorum System. Signy Branch. Jack sat in front of Gar watching over him with his pistol as the youngest bilge son started to open his eyes. His forehead had been split open and they had used liquid bandage to close it up, which they kept in every vehicle on the property. Scrapes and cuts were common in a backwater mining operation that required a little elbow grease to get the drones working correctly most days. They arrived back at the home ship and carried him in, tying him to a bed in the back room of the ship. He had been in and out of consciousness for hours. They had worried that Jar had killed him, which would have been a disaster, and ensured that there would be all-out war between the families. But with him alive, they had something worth bartering. Gar survived. Barely. When he woke, it was clear from the look on his face that his head was pounding. He was still tied to the bed, each appendage tied to a different corner of the bed, with Gar unable to move much at all. Sorry he whacked you so hard, Jack said. Gar moaned. Who hit me? Where am I? You don't recognize me? Jack asked. No, Gar responded through his delirium. All right, we'll get to that when my brothers get here, Jack said. Brothers? Yes, my brothers Jar and Val. Oh, I know where I am now, Gar responded. That's good, Jack said. He knew that he was supposed to be scaring him right now, but that wasn't Jack's way. Being intimidating was for his brothers. Jack just didn't have it in him. A second later, Val and Jar walked through the door. He's up, Jar said in a cheery voice. How are you feeling, old boy? I've been fucking better, Jar, you backstabbing fuck, Gar responded groggily. Oh, me? I'm the backstabbing fuck? What were you mining out there on our property exactly? Jar responded. The youngest bilge son didn't say anything. I thought so. So here's the deal, Val said. We're going to trade you for our lerasum back. The message is already sent to your old man that we caught you doing it and we have you. All cards on the table as far as I'm concerned. Gar stared blankly for a second before breaking into a deep belly laugh. Val, Jar, and Jack made awkward eye contact. "What's so fucking funny?" Jar said as he picked up the crowbar off of the bedside table and raised it. "Y'all are so damn dumb, that's all," Gar said. "Do you think my old man is going to take kindly to this? You think we took your lerasum? Okay, all right. I don't know anything about that. But my old man is going to kill every last one of you for taking me." "We'll see," Jar said as he punched him in the face. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It was a few hours later when the buggy pulled up in front of their home. They hadn't expected the old man to take his sweet time after receiving the message, but apparently he was in no rush to get his son back. He had come alone. He exited the vehicle slowly and stood beside it, waiting for them to come out and meet him there. They did. "I got your message," Old Man Bilge said, spitting black spit on the rock beside him. "At least I think it was yours. Did you send that old man?" "I did. I authorized it," Grandpa responded with confidence. "That's a shame." "What do you mean by that?" Jar injected. "It's a shame that y'all would engage in conspiracies like that and go as far as to kidnap my son. Have you been hitting the bottle?" Old Man Bilge asked sarcastically. "We caught him red-handed," Grandpa said, "mining the scraps of a lerasum vein on our property. He drove right to it and knew where it was. You can't tell me it wasn't you, Bilge. I don't know a good goddamn about whatever you're talking about. Whatever you're accusing me of, you can go fuck yourself. You have 2 days to release my son, and he better be in one piece. If he doesn't come walking his ass back into our home by then, I'm coming back here to get him, and I will kill every last one of y'all to do it." Then, just as quickly as he had arrived, he hopped back into the buggy, peeled around kicking up rocks and dirt, and shot off back into the night. "Fuck," Val said. Chapter 13. Calin Homestead, Planet Castin, Velorum System, Signy Branch. "He's going to know that we're watching them now," Val said, staring at his shoes on the kitchen floor. "He won't move anywhere with us nearby." Jack nodded. "Well, at some point he will, right?" "That's the problem," Grandpa said from his chair in the living room. "I don't know if he wants Gar back. Maybe he doesn't, being the old angry bastard that he is. If it's between the lerasum or his son, I wouldn't put it past him to choose the lerasum. But I do know one thing. He knows that we know. He'll never admit it. But he knows. And he knows he can't make a move to get it off planet without exposing himself. We have to figure that he is going to figure out we have drones in the air and might try to shoot them down. I'd pull them up another 5,000 feet. And then we wait. What are we waiting for? Something to change. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They spent the rest of that evening sitting outside in chairs, watching both the horizon and the feeds from the surveillance drones they had in the sky. They had watched Old Man Bilge return home. One of the sons had met him outside, but then they both had returned back into the house. Since then, nothing had happened. The drones waited above them. Late in the night, they were all falling asleep in their chairs. They weren't much for fire watch, apparently, and the drones had been instructed to sound the alarm if there was any movement on the Bilge homestead. Jack decided that it was safe to go to bed. When Jack got inside the front door, he found the old man asleep in his recliner. He still seemed off to Jack. This whole thing had thrown him for a loop and it was wearing on him. That much was obvious. He covered him up with a blanket, gave his shoulder a love tap, and headed to bed. He lay there for a while, unable to quiet his mind and fall asleep. He waited for the notification to ping on his comms device, signaling that someone had left the Bilge compound. He worried about Anna. He often did. He'd wonder if he should poke his head into her room often to check on her breathing. But he never did. He knew it would be labored, and then he'd have a hard time getting back to sleep himself. He played through many scenarios in his head. Maybe the Bilges would willingly trade some of the lerasum for Gar and they all could go home happy with a new future. But maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd choose to fight for it. Or they might just say, fuck it, and leave Gar behind. If they truly didn't care about Gar, that took away any of the leverage that they thought that they had. Either way, he didn't see an easy path for them to come out of this completely Old Man Bilge wouldn't let kidnapping his son go unnoticed. Jack didn't know how late it was when the intrusive thoughts finally cleared from his mind and he was able to drift off to sleep. But it was late. Jack wasn't sure how long it had been before he was jolted awake by what could be described as the loudest sound that he had ever heard, which was immediately followed by screaming. They were shooting, and from the sounds of it, inside of the house. Jack pulled himself out of bed, grabbed the rifle by his bedside, and peered out down the hallway. It sounded as if a majority of the commotion was coming from the front of the home, near the living room. He could hear Jar and Val screaming, along with other voices. Shots were traded back and forth. Jack crept down the hallway, stopping at Anna's room and cracking the door. Anna scrambled behind the bed as the door opened, pulling a blanket over her. They made eye contact. Jack nodded at her and signaled to stay there by holding his hand up. He closed the door securely behind him. He had taken more than 3 steps down the hallway when there was an explosion. Immediately, the old transport ship that they lived in shook. A bright light flashed the inside of the ship, and the sound was so loud that Jack was absolutely certain that he had ear damage. He couldn't hear anything but could make out a faint popping sound that he knew to be gunshots at the front of the house. He had fallen but pulled himself to his feet. It was hard to see. The old ship was filled with dust. He reached the end of the hallway and turned the corner to the kitchen. There, in the window, Val was trading shots with someone that appeared to be over by the front door of the ship. He was screaming, but Jack still couldn't hear. He crept forward and opened the cabinet below the kitchen sink, still just around the corner from the line of sight from whoever was firing at the front door. There, he knew they kept a small sawed-off shotgun, which would be a better choice than his rifle for close-quarters combat. He picked it up, checked to make sure that his hearing started returning, but the constant sound of gunshots was sending a sharp pain up the back of his neck and into his head. He peeked around the corner. There was Wark Bilge, the uncle to the boys. He was shooting a handgun wildly around the corner while Val traded shots. Jack watched closely. Every few seconds that man would peek, launch a few new shots, then disappear around the corner. Gar was still tied up at the back of the house. They hadn't breached that far yet. There was no way to get to him in the room unless they came through the house. That told Jack that they were here to kill them all to get their man back. The next time that Wark Bilge peeked, Jack jumped from behind the cabinet and shelled the front door 3 times in quick succession. He had always been great with a shotgun. He saw that he had made solid contact with the first shot, some contact with the second, and maybe even the third, although Wark had disappeared around the corner. Jack wasted no time sprinting toward the door with Val in tow. He got outside, turned the corner, and was met with a barrage of bullets from somewhere out in the desert. Beside the door laid Wark, his chest blown wide open and severe wounds to his thighs and midsection. He choked on his own blood and clasped at his chest. Jar exited the door, held his handgun to Wark's head and pulled the trigger. His brains splattered on the concrete patio below him. Jack dove behind the nearby workbench and started returning fire. Instantly, he wished that he hadn't left his rifle sitting up against the sink in the kitchen. Val dove behind the nearby mining drone that was sitting in disrepair and began returning fire with his rifle. Jar joined him. There were 4 of them out there firing back. They ducked into divots in the desert dirt and laid waste to their home. They returned fire, and Jack left cover and dipped back into the ship to grab the rifle. By the time he returned, the gunshots had subsided, and the Bilge clan had turned tail and run off toward the hills. He fired a few shots, but wasn't even really trying to hit them. They sat there in disbelief for a moment, watching the small dots that were the Bilges disappearing into the distance. "What the fuck was that?" Val said breathlessly. "I have no idea," Jack said, staring off into the night. The sun was just starting to peak above the mountaintops. "Oh no, fuck!" Jar screamed from somewhere behind them. Jack turned and ran. He found Jar in the living room staring at the remains of their grandfather. His legs had been completely sheathed off, his pants scorched. His face was completely pale and hollow. There was no life. From the looks of things, he had bled out quickly. Near him, at the back side of the room, a ship window was broken out. They had thrown some sort of explosive through it, judging by the state of the room. Anna let out a blood-curdling wail behind them. She had finally ventured out of her room now that the shooting had stopped. She wept and fell over his bloodied body, or what was left of him at least. Jack tried to pull her off of Grandpa, but she held on as tightly as she could, his blood smeared all over her cheeks and clothes. "We're killing every last one of them," Val said. Chapter 14. Calin Home Ship. Castin Planet. Velorum System. Signy Branch. The dust that the explosion had kicked up into the air throughout the ship had sent Anna's breathing into a multi-hour fit. They had to pull her outside while she heaved, trying to catch her breath. Anna hadn't been able to get it together for the next full day. She was inconsolable. She and Grandpa had been so close. Jack held her that first night as she wept at the back of the house, and Val and Jar kept watch outside. Eventually, she got up and ran out, trying to get some time to herself out in the desert. He'd chased her down. It was too dangerous for anyone to wander off right now. They would snatch one of them up in a heartbeat to get Gar back. Jar was, as you would expect, a puddle of rage. He wanted nothing more than to be unleashed and head to the Bilge homestead, guns blazing. Luckily, Val had been able to talk him down because Jack knew that he would never have been able to. All morning long, he had lobbied to go back to the back room and get answers from Gar. Jack had been able to keep him from doing it, but only for a few hours. Val went into town the long way, which looped out far away from the Bilge homestead, and went to see Lavernus to tell him about Grandpa and pick up the rest of his drones. They weren't sure how the Bilges were able to sneak out of their house without being detected by the drones, but they had all decided that it would at least be a good idea to make sure that they had some sitting in the sky above their own home as well. Worse yet, if they could sneak out to attack them, they could sneak out to move the lerasum without them seeing. Jackson knew they needed to find where it was, and quick. Val returned about 3 hours later, with an extra trailer in tow behind the buggy. He stopped in front of their home, hopped out, and swung open the doors of the trailers to expose another 5 or 6 drones, taking up every inch of the old rickety trailers. "Lavernus fell apart when I told him about Grandpa. He wants to help. He gave us every drone he had," Val said. "Good," Jack said. "We could really use these." Mostly, he just wanted to make sure that they could keep Anna safe. Briefly, they had discussed sending her to a neighboring homestead, but that would require telling them why she was there. The last thing they needed was more people to know about the lerasum. "Oh, that isn't all," Val said before walking to the back of the buggy and opening up the small trunk at the back. There, neatly packed, were 2 stacks of C4 explosives and 4 smaller drone boxes. "Me and Lavernus were talking about different ways we can get at these guys. See, they have a lot of guns. Lavernus was saying that there's too much risk in us going head-to-head with them, but if we bring bombs down on top of their head, what are they going to do about it?" Jack nodded and snapped his finger at Val. "I like it," he said. Bombing them with mini-drones would have been seen a ridiculous suggestion just a day ago, but now it seemed necessary. If it was us or them, he preferred that it be them, and it was too late to turn back the clock on this thing. Jackson had been tasked with cleaning up Grandpa, which included moving his body into a wooden box behind the home and scrubbing the floors. He was sick and cried throughout, but it had to be done. They couldn't leave their grandfather smeared all over the living room. Luckily, the interior was mostly metal, so there would only be a few stains and reminders of what had happened. To make matters worse, the explosion had ripped a hole in the hull at the back of the room. It was about 1.5 feet across and pointed in a direction that the wind typically roared in from at night. Jack covered it with a tarp, but they were going to need something better than that if they didn't want to get frozen out come nightfall. Once Jack had finished and Val had the drones in the air above their homestead, it was time for them to speak to Gar. Jackson checked in on Annie. She was in bed, her face streaked with tears with bright red nostrils. He patted her and told her to put on some headphones. She nodded and did as he asked. They walked in the room to find Gar awake and staring back at them. Val had given him a knockout shot of clonazepam the night before, but it appeared to be decently worn off. They had saved some to loosen him up if he absolutely refused to talk. Anything to keep Jar from killing him. "Last fucking chance," Jar said. "Tell me where the lerasum is or I'm going to rip your throat out." Well, that was a way to start. Gar spit on the floor in front of them. "Fuck you!" Jar didn't waste a second. He cocked back and landed a punch square on Gar's nose. A fountain of blood began rushing from it, spilling down his chest. "Try again!" "Fuck you!" Gar responded. Jar landed another punch, this time directly on his left eye, which made Jack wince. Gar coughed and moaned. Jar gave him a few moments to recover and landed another punch, then another, and another, before Val held out his arm to signal him to stop and bent down in front of him. "You need to tell us about the lerasum, Gar. You tell us and you'll be able to go home. I tell you shit and my daddy will kill me when I get back either way. Why would I tell you anything?" Val nodded, stood up and stepped back from Gar. He gave Jar another slight nod and he went to work again. This little charade went on for another couple of hours. Gar refused to say anything, and by the end his face looked like a swollen plum. Jar had to start hitting him with objects in his arms, torso, and legs, as his hands had grown too sore, and he was afraid he'd kill him if he hit him in the face anymore. They were afraid that if he hit him much more in the face, they might accidentally kill him. Jack had left after about an hour of beating. He understood that after Grandpa, they had no choice. It was now or never. If they couldn't figure out where the lerasum was, they were almost sure to lose it forever. Eventually, someone would be able to sneak away. They already knew that they had a route, although Jack couldn't figure out for the life of him how the bilges were able to evade the drones watching over them. He spent the next few hours launching the remaining drones. They had 7 mini-drones, which were capable of carrying a C4 brick apiece. They were going to use the mining detonation system they already had to blow them up when the time was right. They also had another 5 drones that they could put up into the sky to watch over things. Jack strategically positioned 3 drones in a triangle shape around their home. Their vision zones overlapped with one another, so, in theory, no one should be getting onto their property without alerting them. 2 of the drones were primarily watching the north and south directions of the road and the portions of the desert that flanked the house on either side. Another drone that they had laying around was positioned to the north, watching over the property out there. That left 2 more full-sized drones to be deployed. The first, he decided, should go watch over the lerasum vein. Jack doubted that any of the bilges would be so risky as to go out there again, but if they did, there was a good chance that they would lead them back to the rest of the haul. It was too important to ignore. The last drone was set to rove over their own property. He didn't know what else to do. They had managed to sneak out of their house to come and attack them, so they must have had a way out. And that meant they could show up at their doorstep again at any time. With the drone positioned high, they'd have at least a 5-minute warning, even if they were high, railing it to them on a land speeder. That was all of the drones that Lavernus had. They had officially depleted the drone supply in the whole county, given the fact that Lavernus was the only shop in the county that carried drones. Jackson was happy when the moans from Gar had subsided. But when they started back up again, he decided that he was going to head into town once more, to see if Lavernus had anything that would help him to seal up the tear in the hull in the living room. He was going to have to be careful. He didn't want to get caught out on his own by the bilges. Luckily, he knew a route that would keep him off of the main road without wasting too much time. Chapter 15. Born. Planet Castin. Velorum System. Signy Branch. The elder bilge and the youngest son rode a beaten-down solar buggy into town. He didn't have to look up and squint to know that there were drones above him watching his every move. They had discovered that shortly before they'd hit them at their home. They had bought them from Lavernus, no doubt. There was no other place to get them within 100 kilometers. And if he was willing to sell drones to them, he could sell them to the bilges, too. They could use an eye in the sky. And once they had used them to shoot down the Calin drones, they'd be able to get out cleanly, knowing that they weren't being watched. That was the plan anyway, but the Calins were too stupid without the old man to figure that out. He pulled the buggy up behind the mining supply store and parked behind the old dusty building that was Lavernus's shop that sat adjacent to the store. They wanted to stay hidden, just in case the Calin boys came riding into town. No one wanted to get caught with their pants down. He hopped out of the buggy, his old bones cracking and creaking, and he rose to his feet. That was new. He had always been spry for his age, but these last few years he had started to feel weathered. But he wasn't going to let that stop him from getting his hands on some lerasum if it's right there for the taking. He'd gladly die for that. He'd gladly sacrifice a child. He'd already sacrificed his brother Wark for that. It killed him, but he couldn't think about it now. And he was an idiot for running up to the front door. Of course, he got killed doing that. Once he was out, he reached back into the buggy's glove compartment, pulled out his pistol, and tucked it into the back of his work pants. He walked around the front and entered the shop through the front door. His entrance was announced with a ring. Then Lavernus, the strange, fat-ass man that he was, poked his head out from the backroom door. "Mr. Bilge," he said, a little surprised. "How are you? How is the gear holding up? Here to sell more? Wark came in and—" "I need some drones," Myron Bilge interrupted gruffly. "Every drone you have." "Oh," Lavernus said, wiping his head off on his shirt with awkward flicks on his chest. "Yes. Well, you see, we are actually all sold out of drones." Old man Bilge lowered his brow and stared at him for several seconds. "What do you mean?" he growled. "They've been sold. We recently had our stock bought out," Lavernus stuttered. "By the Calins. I can't disclose what our customers have purchased from us." "Cut the shit, Lavernus," Old man Bilge interrupted. "I know that you sold them those drones. I know because we've seen them up there, keeping watch on our house and following us around every time we take a step. And you knew what they were going to use them for." He rapped his knuckles on the counter between them, gritting his teeth. This asshole had chosen sides. "Oh no, Mr. Bilge, I assure you I did not. I don't ask questions, I just sell my products." "Bullshit," he said as he spit a hunk of chewing tobacco onto the shop floor. "You're all buddy-buddy with those degenerates. Besides, who comes in here and buys out your stock of expensive drones and you don't ask any questions?" "I value privacy," Lavernus replied. "I know you know about the lerasum, Lavernus." Lavernus fell silent. They held eye contact for several seconds. "What do you want from me?" "Me? Oh, nothing," Old man Bilge said as he ran his arm along a shelf and knocked all of the items onto the floor. Lavernus winced. "I actually just came down here to buy some drones. I already knew you had to have sold them the ones that they were using to illegally spy on us. But now I find out that you've sold them every drone that you have? Seems to me that you've chosen sides here, Lavernus." Lavernus held his gaze for a moment, reading the situation, longing to know how mad the old man was. "I can promise you I've done no such thing. A customer asks for drones and I sell them. I made a pretty penny from that sale. What am I supposed to do? Say no?" The old man nodded, and his eldest son walked behind him to the entrance behind the counter and folded his arms. "Yeah, maybe you are a shrewd businessman," the old man said as he continued to waltz around the storefront, obnoxiously knocking items off of the shelf. "But I've never known you to be that type of man, Lavernus." "And what type of man do you know me to be, Mr. Bilge?" Lavernus replied, a sheen of sweat visibly accumulating on his forehead. He thought about it for a moment. "I'm not sure, actually. A fake aristocrat, I reckon. I've never been able to square how you got all the way out here. Doesn't seem like the type of place that a person like you would end up." Lavernus held his hands together and gave an empathetic nod. Apparently that fake aristocrat bit had hit home. "Yes. Well, circumstances out of my control brought me here, and I do admit that I have always felt quite out of place, but I make the best of it." "Maybe," the old man said as he stomped in his heavy boots back up to the counter, having had his fill of knocking items off of the shelves. "Or maybe you've managed to dig yourself a hole that you can't climb out of, cozying up to the wrong people because you are a confused, lost old man." Lavernus tightened in his stance and sat awkwardly silent for a moment. "All right, Mr. Bilge, I'll tell you what. We have our storage shed out back. I might have some drones out there. Small ones, maybe. Let me go take a look and see if I have any for you on the house." The old man raised an eyebrow and gave a smirk. "All right, that sounds more like it." Lavernus nodded and slowly turned around, heading past the son who was still standing with his arms folded and a less than bemused expression for the back door. As soon as his back was turned, Mr. Bilge followed him through the door into the slim hallway. Lavernus hadn't noticed, or at least he acted like he hadn't. Just as he went to reach for the door handle to the back door that led to the shed, the old man reached into the back of his pants, pulled out the pistol, and fired it into the back of Lavernus's head, a red mist splattering the door and walls behind him. Chapter 16. born. Planet Castin. Velorum System. Cygni branch. The back way to town, through the northernmost side of the neighboring Kinlow property, added about 20 minutes each way. Truth be told, Jack was happy to waste the time. He had his handgun with him, but if he ran into the bilges on his own, he was almost certainly going to be killed. Not only that, the extra time gave him a few peaceful moments to think, away from the sounds of torture that were taking place back in their home ship. Jack felt blank. A week ago, everything had been fine as it could be, anyway, the same as it had always been, and that was how he wanted it. He wanted that back. But that wasn't going to happen. Often, Jack's thoughts would drift to Anna when she was young. Before the lung problem, she would ride around with him on the buggy, keeping an eye on the mining drones as they did their work. She had been about 4 and had loved it, but slowly the desert cough started to creep in. At first, it wasn't much more than the occasional cough, but over time it grew into a hack, and then into asthma attacks. Now she was a young woman that lived on a desert planet that was killing her. Her lungs were so damaged, their only real option was a transplant, according to her doctor. And with no lung growth labs in the Sci-Fi belt, she'd have to go closer to the core to get a new set. Transport alone was expensive, and they'd need 2 tickets. It was too dangerous for her to travel alone, not to mention the cost of the lungs and procedure, which was easily several dozen times more expensive than the transport. They never were going to have enough money. It was never even an option. But then he had discovered that glowing vein in the mountains. It was getting on toward afternoon now. The sun was high and it was hot. Jack wore a hat to cover his bronzed face from the sun. He wound through a desolate region that was mostly home to the equivalent of cacti and desert weeds, kicking up dust as he went. He weaved in and out down the path that he himself had worn into their property. They had asked him about it once, why he was driving through the land that they owned. He hadn't had a good explanation. He said he just liked to take the long way sometimes. They hadn't cared, so he had never stopped. Jack pulled into town from the backside of Lavernus's store. He pulled up, parked his solar buggy, and tried to walk in through the back door. It moved, but then didn't. It wouldn't budge. He pushed harder. Something was on the other side of the door. He groaned as he pushed against it. Whatever was there, it had a little bit of give. It seemed like the door was opening 1/4 of an inch farther each time that he pushed. He decided to walk around. As he did, he looked across the dusty road and at his surroundings to make sure that he wasn't being watched. When he didn't see anything, he quickly popped through the front door. "Lavernus!" Jack called out when he didn't see him at the front. No reply. Suddenly, Jack could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He made his way around the back of the store, near the pistons and primers, and went behind the front counter. Lavernus was always here, and he would never leave the door unlocked if he wasn't. It wasn't that kind of place. He crept along near the front until he reached the back hallway that led to the back entrance of Lavernus' shop. There, sticking out just beyond the door, were a pair of black dress shoes, far too clean for where they were. Jack froze in place. He floated around the edge to find Lavernus laying there, his arm strangely bent behind his stomach, his face on the concrete floor, and a large red hole in the back of his head. The walls surrounding him were splattered with blood. Jack felt his stomach lurch up into his throat. His eyes welled with tears as he knelt down to inspect the body. He looked pale. Jack touched an exposed bit of arm. He was cold. Lavernus was dead. Asterisk, 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 Jack had bawled his eyes out the entire way home on the buggy. Lavernus has been a nice man. He had gone far out of his way to make sure that their family had been taken care of when they needed it most. He had often, over years, extended them credit for mining drone parts and other necessary supplies. He had, of course, been an absolute ace in the hole throughout this feud with the bilges. He had always been so appreciative of Lavernus, a man who hadn't needed to stay here and run a small supply store on a backwater planet that had never reached its potential. But he had. Jack had never known why, and had never bothered to fully ask. There were a lot of questions that had internally wondered about Lavernus's life. He would never get to ask those questions now. He arrived home about 30 minutes later, his face streaked red, despite how hard he had tried to clean up before walking inside. "What now?" Val asked as he ran into him outside of the front of their home ship. They killed Lavernus. What? Why would they do that? I don't know. They probably found out that he was helping us, shot him through the back of his head in the back hallway of the shop. Val hung his head into his hands. He had always liked Lavernus, too. What a waste, Wara. C. Chapter 17. Calin Homeship. Castin Planet. Velorum System. Signy Branch. Val had taken the news hard. Anna had cried again, but her slobbery crying fit eventually turned into a coughing fit, and Jack had been forced to usher her back to her room, give her a steroid shot, and turn on the humidifier to help ease the pain of feeling like she was breathing through a straw. Eventually, she had calmed down and whimpered herself to bed. Jar had just been angry. He hadn't said a word, but his reddened face said enough. He'd sat in the kitchen for several hours, casually sipping away at the corn vodka he had been saving and occasionally beating his fist against the table. The feeling of hopelessness came over Jack as he laid in his bed. He wouldn't sleep a wink that night. He just couldn't get the image of Lavernus laying there with a gaping hole in the back of his head, or the image of his grandfather cut in half in the living room. He couldn't shake just how unfair it all seemed. His family had been here for 2, and with some luck, a quarter generations. Grandpa had been one of the first people to homestead in the Bourne area. He had been a community figure. That's how Jack knew that news of the feud had already made its way around Bourne. Otherwise, there would have been a never-ending parade of fake sympathies and frozen casseroles that they probably would never eat. Of course, they couldn't tell anyone that he was dead until this was resolved. The thought of it made his chest fill with rage. Jack wasn't normally the type to get so angry. But this was a different thing altogether. They had been robbed, not just of some vein, but of the family's future, a future that belonged to them. Then, when they had tried to stand up for themselves, it had gotten Grandpa and Lavernus killed. Had it been Val, Jar, or even Jack himself, he could live with it, but not those two. They didn't deserve this. What killed Jack was that his grandfather's final memory was watching everything he had hoped for be ripped from his hands. If they had managed to find that lerasum vein first, he would have seen his biggest dream come true. Years late, but true nonetheless. He could have died of natural causes with a peaceful mind, knowing that generations of his family would be cared for based on the decisions that he made. Instead, he died figuring himself for a failure. And he didn't deserve it. It wasn't true. Not at A. They couldn't let that pass. They were in too deep now. Jack would almost rather the rest of them, save for Anna, die trying to get the lerasum back then to let the bilges leave and live happily ever after. That wasn't going to do. Then, as if God himself had been listening to Jack's mind, his comms terminal chimed. He picked it up from his bedside table and looked at the screen. New notification from Drone 5. Movement detected. He opened the notification. It was from a drone that was monitoring the land just south of the bilge property. It had trained in on a piece of land. There, in the sand, the earth itself looked as if it slid. The drone zeroed in on a rock face that appeared to move several feet. As it slid, a dark hole opened in the ground and side of the rock face. Jack couldn't see anything in the hole, but it continued to expand until it was perhaps 15 feet across. Then, a light switched on in the hole, illuminating what appeared to be a corridor under the ground. A figure climbed out, emerging into view outside of the opening in the rock face. Then the red lights on the comms terminal started blinking. The drone zoomed out to reveal a large, long hauler truck coming screaming across the desert, dust clouds left in its wake. It sped as fast as it could, straight to the new opening and pulled around it, before pulling in front and backing its way down the ramp. Jack could feel his heart racing. This was it. The bilges had hidden the lerasum in an underground facility, and they were going to load it into that truck and take it to wherever they were heading with it, and they were doing it tonight. Now. A bang so loud that Jack immediately knew it was a gunshot rang from the back of the home ship. He stuffed his comms terminal into his pocket and sprinted out of his bedroom and toward the back of the hallway where Gar was being kept. He walked into the room to see Gar in the center, still tied to the bed. In front of him was Jar, holding his revolver to his side. Gar had a giant hole in his chest, and scarlet blood poured out of the hole and out of his mouth, spilling onto his chest. "What the fuck?" Val said as he came flying in behind them, using Jack to slow his speed as Gar choked on his own blood, sputtering down onto his beard and neck. "That's for the old man," Jar said through gritted teeth as he watched Gar take his last breaths. "And Lavernus." Gar's body fell silent. The violent heave and hoe of his chest died. He lay still, and they all sat in shock for a moment. "I know where the lerasum is," Jack said. Chapter 18. Calin homeship, Castin planet, Velorum System, Cygni branch. "Well, I'll be damned," Val said as they watched the video in the kitchen. They hadn't even bothered to clean up Gar's body. It still sat strapped to the chair in the bedroom, his head angled back awkwardly. "They're moving it. They're moving it tonight," Jack corrected. "No way would they make that move, knowing we could be watching and not transport it quickly." Val nodded. "How long, though? How quickly can they move it?" "Shit, that much lerasum based on how big I think that vein was, with the drones loading it for them? Still at least a few hours," Jar said, calmed by the revelation. "We hit them tonight." That seemed a little rushed to Jack, but then again, he didn't see how they had an option. If they drove away with that lerasum, they were never getting it back. "Yeah, but how?" Val asked. "We just wait until they drive out and start firing at them?" "Yep," Jar said, having put absolutely no thought into whether or not that was the right idea. "Well, hang on. Do you think shots can even stop that truck? You saw that thing. Rifles aren't stopping that," Jack said, rolling back the tape to show the meaty transport truck. "We are going to need something stronger." "Like what?" "The mining C4. We got enough of it to stop that thing dead in its tracks," Jack said. Val's eyes lit up and he snapped his fingers. "Yes, so we fly them outside of that big garage exit and wait for them to come out." "Exactly. And we're waiting out there with rifles to clean anything else up." "Yep," Val said, raising his eyebrows. "That's actually a great idea. If they are well placed, well, shit, that should put it out. Not guaranteeing that it will kill everyone. But then we have a couple still flying for the cleanup and secondary vehicles." Jack nodded his head in silence for a moment. "I like it. It makes sense. I think I can rig up the drones to be ordered in quick succession to drop on their heads. No guarantees, though. But if we're going to do this, we got to do it right. Do it all the way. There is one thing we have to make sure of." "What's that?" Jar asked. "Every one of them has to die. Not one bilge can survive and get away. Because if they do, this isn't over. They will keep coming back until either they get the lerasum or all of them are dead. And we have to watch our backs for the rest of our lives," Jack said. Chapter 19. Bilge Homestead, Castin Planet, Velorum System, Cygni Branch. Turning the drones into remote-controlled kamikaze bombers had actually been a relatively simple task. Jack had strapped the smart C4 case to the drone, wired them together, and updated the system with coded instructions for the C4 to detonate on the drone's impact. Of course, Jack couldn't test and debug the issue without wasting one of their drones or C4 cases, so he ran some simulations and was content with just hoping that it would work the way that it was supposed to. He had confidence in his logic. Altogether, they have 5 drone bombs that they could drop on their heads, definitely enough to immobilize their transport truck, hopefully enough to kill them all. If not, they all had Gauss rifles that they could use to clean things up. Jack could feel himself being dragged deeper into not giving a fuck. Killing, that wasn't him. Or at least it hadn't been him before all this started. But you kill Grandpa and you kill Lavernus for no reason at all. The paradigm had changed. The Bilges were not just trying to steal away the bloodline's future, they were killing everything he loved in the process. Normally, Jack would be inclined to try to talk things out. Maybe they take half of the lerasum and leave half behind. Everyone goes home rich. No one dies. They probably wouldn't have accepted it, Jack knew that. The Bilges just weren't the types to split a fortune like that in half. They'd sooner steal it, obviously. When they had thrown those explosives into the home ship, they hadn't taken a look to see who would be hit. Anna could have been there. At any other time of the day, there was a good chance that she would have been in there. crouched behind a table to avoid the gunfire, and she would have died, horrifically, so fuck them. Doubts flew through his head. What if the bombs didn't go off? What if the vehicle wasn't disabled and it just kept on driving? All the scenarios. There was a lot riding on this, but Jack kept telling himself that their current plan was the best option. Dropping explosives in their head was perhaps the most humane and conflict-free way to end this. No pain, just boom, then bits of them strewn all over the desert floor. It was as good as it was going to get. Then there was the question of what to do with Anna. None of them were comfortable leaving her at the home ship while this thing went down. There was always the chance that the bilges would be on to them and they might come back here to look for Gar. Once they realized that poor old Gar had a fucking hole through his chest, well, they didn't want Anna here for them to exact their revenge on. After much back and forth, they decided that they would have Anna watch from the hills some ways away. If things went south, she'd have a buggy to escape on. She could head for their cousins in Callao, about 400 kilometers south. Still, taking her out in the desert was a bad idea. Her lungs could seize up at any moment, particularly if they were kicking up a bunch of dust with literal bombs. Saving all of the lerasum in the universe wouldn't be worth it if she died right there in front of them. They went back and forth on what to do with her for a full 10 minutes before they decided that they would bring her, but keep her away from the action. There was a ridge about 500 meters from the opening in the rock face. She would stay there, with her injection ready to go if her lungs started to freeze. If things went south and she wasn't sure if they were going to win, they told her to run toward town. By now, someone else surely would have discovered Lavernus's body. There was sure to be authorities poking around in town. In fact, if they had given them enough time to dig, there is a good chance that the authorities would have shown up knocking on their home ship sometime soon. Everyone gets questioned when someone comes up dead. While Anna was on her stomach on top of the ridge watching the action unfold, Jack, Jar, and Val would be positioned in a triangle in front of the opening with Gauss rifles. If anyone came running out, they'd shower them in bullets and hope they went down. When the time came, they loaded the solar vehicles and headed in the opposite direction of the bilge compound, in case they had eyes on them. If they did, with some luck, they might think that they were hightailing it out of there. Either way, they were going to have to take the long way around and approach the compound from the back. The drive took several hours since they had to go all the way around the bilge homestead to approach from the back, and Jack's stomach was in knots the entire way. He ran over the plan again and again in his mind. It was simple, but the simplicity made Jack worry about whether or not they were taking too basic of an approach. Would they expect it? Their entire family could die today if they made the wrong choice. They approached the compound from the backside slowly, so as not to kick up too much dust on the horizon. They found a small hill about 2 miles away, the perfect place for Annie to watch from, and more discreet than the hill a few hundred meters away. Her part in this thing was simple. She was to watch through her binoculars. If we won, she could stay. If things went badly, she was to jump on the nearest solar buggy and head for town. If authorities were there, she would ask them for help. If not, she'd continue on toward the cousins and refuse to stop for any reason until she got there. Jack had messaged ahead to let them know that she might be stopping by, but didn't offer any details about why, just that she might be in the area. He'd let Anna decide how much their cousins needed to know if things went that direction. They dropped Anna off and parked the vehicles on the backside of the hill line. There was always a chance that they had a drone or some type of surveillance watching the compound, but Jack was hoping that they wouldn't be keeping an eye on all of the surrounding desert. They crept forward in their hands and knees until they reached the small hill a few hundred meters from the opening and laid on the backside of it. There they piled their guns and supplies on the ground. It wasn't much. A couple of shotguns, some rifles, a handgun for each of them, and Jack's drone controller. He looked up in the sky, but couldn't catch a glimpse of them. That made him feel better, because he was going to have to call them down soon. According to the manual, each drone could probably hold upwards of 50 pounds before it would have trouble flying. And if that is what the manual said, he was going to bet that each could realistically carry double that weight. So they were going to have no problem flying around with a brick or two of C4 strapped to them. The 3 drones hovered in a triangle formation above the exit in the rock face. The other drone, with double C4 bricks strapped to it, was playing river to get a view of the whole property. Jack was counting on that double C4 drone to finish them off. Jack, Val, and Jar crept to the edge of the embankment and surveyed the area around the underground opening. If they hadn't have known where it was, they would have never seen it. Val looked at it through the night vision binoculars. Jack took a quick look, then passed them back to Jar. He'd get a good look from the drone cameras. The doors were uncovered. That had changed. Every time they had closed them previously, they were covered with a sand-colored tarp that made the opening difficult to spot, even from drones. "Remember the plan. Triangle up, crossfire their location so they get pinned down. Drop a bomb on the truck's engine to disable it. When they ball up around the truck, you bring the bombs down on them," Val said, extending his fist for a bump. "That's the plan," Jack said, and fist-bumped him back. They both looked to Jar, who nodded. "Let's kill these filthy bilges." The three of them crept up. Jack didn't have far to travel. He was shooting from the eastern side of the doorway, about 100 meters in front of the hill they were on now. Val would be in the middle, to Jack's right, and directly in front of the rock-face exit. Jar on the backside. They gathered their weapons. "Go!" Jar whispered as loudly as he could. Jack crawled along the ground, worming up dust as he ran. He was moving toward a few large rocks that were about 50 meters from the subterranean door. Jar ducked and ran, his feet pattering against the cold desert sand, but stayed low to the ground before setting up on the backside of a small hill across from Jack. Val moved to his spot. The desert nights were quiet as could be, and was working its way toward freezing as the sun had now been down for nearly an hour and a half. They weren't sure when they would try to leave, just that they would do it under the cover of darkness. Jack could feel the knot in his stomach cinching down as they waited 5 minutes. Then 10, then 20, then an hour. Jack felt himself start to lose awareness, but forced himself to focus with a long, hard sniff of some smelling salts that Jar had passed to him early. After an hour and 20 minutes, they heard the familiar creak of old metal scraping across itself. "Go time," Val said over the comms. Then, the old doors split in the middle, kicking up a plume of dust. Things sat silent for a moment, and then Jack saw 2 strong beams of light come shooting out the upward-sloping ramp and out into the sky. Jack rose just as the nose of a large truck began to peek out of the opening. It rolled out and leveled itself on the sand. One man, who Jack thought he recognized as the middle bilge brother, was hanging onto the outside of the passenger side door. Val wasted no time, letting off rounds as soon as they were out. Within seconds, he had plugged the man on the door right in the chest, and he had fallen to the ground, screaming and coughing up blood. Val had always been a good shot. Jack ducked down and pulled out the contrack and screen for the drones. Each was now hovering about 300 meters in the air, lights off to be safe. He selected the first drones with 1 brick of C4 explosive material strapped to it, then selected the camera view. Jar lit the truck up with a hail of bullets. The drone's interface showed the land below where could clearly see the front end of the truck. He waited a moment. Not knowing where people were, he wanted to see if he could find a way to inflict some damage outside of just the truck itself. A man hopped out from the large back bed of the truck at the backside and started unloading at Jar, who returned fire back. Jack waited a moment, waiting to see where the next man would appear. No one did. But the man that Jack now recognized as the eldest bilge son was in the perfect location to try to disable the left driver's side wheel of the large truck and hit him at the same time. He selected a spot just a few feet to the side of the man, hugging close to the vehicle. He gave the order to dive bomb. The gap closed almost instantly on the video. The drones were terrifyingly fast when they wanted to be. It impacted, and the explosion rocked the vehicle. The eldest brother was vaporized almost immediately, a red splash across the desert sand. The truck rocked back and forth for several seconds before settling. When the dust disappeared, Jack could see that the left front wheel and axle had been severely damaged. It looked like the axle was busted in half. The truck wasn't going anywhere. The gunfire returned, and Jack could hear several people yelling. Multiple shooters were still inside the covered garage area, and unfortunately the truck had been disabled in a spot that gave them really solid cover. A hand stuck out from behind the truck and fired wild and blind from a pistol. 2 men hopped out of the other side of the truck, facing Jack, throwing a rain of bullets toward him as he ducked behind the rock, listening to them ricochet off into the sand and dry air around him. Jack snuck a quick look and realized it was the younger Bilge brother and his father. Val laid down some cover fire. Another man that Jack did not recognize pulled another gun from his belt line and walked fearlessly out from behind the truck toward Val, dumping bullets as he went. "What the fuck are you doing, Jack? Bring the boom down on them!" Jar yelled into the channel. Shit. The gunfire had made him slow on the uptake. He lined up the next drone kamikaze shot, but the man had ventured too far away from the vehicle and the rest of the team. He couldn't kill them both. Without a second thought, he prioritized the vehicle and lined up the second drone to come down on top of the eldest brother's head. And it did. This impact sent the truck bouncing, now unable to move. The unidentified man kept dumping bullets in Val's direction, and one connected with his shoulder, shooting a mist of red into the air. Val let out a scream and ducked behind the rock he had been using for refuge. Jar left his own spot of refuge and sprinted toward Val, kicking up dust as he ran. "No!" John screamed. The remaining Bilges retreated back inside the underground entrance, and 2 men poked their heads out and fired at Jar as he streaked quickly across the desert. Without hesitation this time, Jack cued the third and final C4-strapped drone, and within milliseconds it had bombed through the doors and landed somewhere inside. The explosion blew outward, sending the heavy metal doors flying into the air and creating a fireball 20 feet into the sky. The big truck lurched forward, and the tarps covering the load were ripped off, exposing the green glowing lerasum in the back of the truck. "It's here!" Johns yelled into the channel. Jack saw a blackened hand reach out of the entrance and pull himself into the desert sand. It was the youngest brother. He coughed up a pile of blood into the sand in front of him, then lay still. Meanwhile, the unknown man had been trading shots with Jar while working his way toward Val. Val popped up from behind the rock and popped a shot into the man's shoulder. He groaned, but ran quickly around the nearer rock and let bullets fly. Jack could hear Val screaming, then silence. "No!" Jar screamed as he reached the rock, unloading a full clip of bullets into the man's chest. He ran to be beside Val, lifted his head into his arms, and sobbed. Jack knew Val was dead. He didn't have to look. It was going to kill him, but he couldn't worry about that now. He counted up the bodies in his head. The first blast had killed 1, the second 2, the third 2, plus the unknown man. Gar was already gone. 1 left. Old Man Bilge. Jack pulled the shotgun he had strapped around his right shoulder and hoisted it. "Jar, let's go. The old man is still alive." "Okay," Jar said through the tears. He drew his weapon and ran to meet Jar at the entrance. They peeked in. The 2 poor bastards that had been hit with the third C4 drone weren't much more than a red smudge across the ramp leading out of what appeared to be an underground garage. Johns hoped he'd see the old man laying there too, but he didn't. The metal ramp had eaten the blast surprisingly well. Jack wondered how long this underground enclosure had been here. Had it always been here? Had they built it just for this? Jack was sure that he would have noticed if it had always been here. It's hard to miss anything that happens one homestead over when there's nothing else to pay attention to. They walked past the truck filled with lerasum, illuminating the entrance with a splash of green, down the incline, boots thudding against the metal. Jack held his shotgun square against his shoulder, scanning as he walked. They were walking into a long metallic hallway. At the back end, where he assumed the tunnel ran under the bilge house, were machines and workbenches that Jack assumed had been used to store and load the lerasum. They crept slowly, not wanting to let him get the jump on either of them. As they approached the back area with the scattered machinery, Jack realized that there were many places for him to hide. "You here, old man?" Jar yelled, realizing the same thing. "I am," the raspy voice called back. Jack wasn't sure where it had come from. There were so many echoes in the metallic tunnel. "Come on out and let's get on with it then," Jar said playfully. "All right," Old Man said before popping out from behind a broken-down mining bit, firing and sinking a bullet into Jar's lower right side neck area. He stood in shock for a moment, coughed, and fell to the ground. He touched the wound with the tip of his finger as blood poured down and over his hand. He looked wide-eyed at Jack, who bent down and helped Jar press his hand against the wound to slow the blood. Jar didn't say anything, having the awareness to know that the old man was out there. Jack held up one finger and nodded to Jar to let him know that he was coming back. Jack popped his head up. The good news was that old man seemed to only be armed with a pistol. If he could close the gap, his shotgun would win the fight. But he couldn't see him. It was too dark, the only lights from the workbenches against the far back wall and the faint green glow of the lerasum in the back of the truck. He was sure the old man had moved. "Are we the last ones?" Old man's voice echoed. "Jar's alive, but yes, we're the last. You killed my family, boy, ended my bloodline. And if I don't kill you, you'll do the same to mine. Is the girl dead too? No, she isn't here." "Smart," Old man said. "I'll make sure to track her down after all this." Jack snarled and launched 2 rounds of buckshot into a table he thought Old Man might be behind based on the sound of his voice. "Nope," the old man taunted. Jack inched his way forward, slicing the barrel of his gun behind objects and toward corners as he moved. "What would you even do with the lerasum if you got your hands on it, boy? You destroyed the truck. How are you going to transport it? Then you need to get it on a ship. Do you have a ship?" "I'll take my chances and worry about that after I kill you." Old man laughed. "Do you have any idea how much that shit is worth? That much of it? Enough to live wealthy 1,000 times. Or more. Who are you going to sell it to, boy? You're going to get robbed, probably end up dead. And you had a plan, I assume?" "Of course I did. Started putting it together as soon as we found the vein. We have the ship, we have the buyer, price is locked in. I'm not moving this much lerasum around with a half-cocked plan." "Oh yeah? And what will you even do with all that money? You're on your way out, old man, and you have no heirs." He was quiet for a moment. "There's enough money there to buy an heir. Get him young, raise him up right, give him an empire. You think you have time for that? We'll see." Old man jumped out from behind a concrete beam and let one off wildly. The bullet ricocheted off of the floors and up into Jack's shin. He yelled and took cover behind some nearby machinery. "Come and get it!" Old man bellowed. Jack scuttled along the outside of the underground enclosure, moving from pile of junk to piece of machinery. He could see the old man about 30 feet away, looking around in the dark, waving his pistol. Once he had rotated nearly 180 degrees around the man, he took cover behind a workbench. Old man Bilge fired off another blast randomly in Jack's vicinity. "Come on out, boy!" He fired again, and the blast's echo was deafening off the cold metal walls. Now. His hands drenched in sweat, Jack took off toward the old man. He was on top of him before his old, frail body could swivel around. He raised his shotgun to old man's face and squeezed the trigger. His head evaporated into a sheet of pink mist, spraying all surfaces directly behind him. His body seemed to hang in the air for a moment, then slumped to the ground with a thud. Jack slowly lowered the gun to his side and let himself slide to the ground. Tears welled up in his eyes. It was done. He allowed himself just a short time to let his emotions out, then he gathered his gun and made his way back to Jar, who laid lifeless, staring blankly up at the ceiling above him. Jack bent down and felt for a pulse. He was gone. Jack made his way out through the devastation at the front entrance, and then walked out to see Anna. She was hiding behind the solar buggy, with a grip of death on the back bar, her knuckles purple. "Are they?" she asked, poking her head out from around the back of the vehicle. Jack nodded. Anna burst into tears and ran toward Jack, embracing him. He cried. They wept together. He turned around, staring at the large truck and the green glow coming out of its bed. "It's just us now," Jack said. He had some things to figure out. How he was going to move the lerasum, who he was going to sell it to, how he would keep the authorities off their back. They'd come knocking eventually. But none of it mattered now. He'd figure it out. "You're going to get some new lungs, Anna," Jack said with a broad smile.